Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. After last week's slight sojourn into the American wilderness for some War of 1812 goodness, today we're going back to normal service and having looked at how to use the Austrian infantry, today we're going to look at how to use their mounted counterparts, how to use Austrian cavalry. Now the first thing to mention, as with the Austrian infantry, Austrian cavalry regiments were absolutely humongous. The Austrian Empire had, am I allowed to call it the Austrian Empire? I'm not sure if it was the Austrian Empire at this point. I think it was. Anyway, Austria, they had absolutely fantastic land for raising horses. You had, down in the south, you had the plains of Hungary, and up in the north you also had Poland and areas like that as well. So there's an absolutely huge range and mixture of the skill sets and different types of cavalry that were around at the time. It's worth remembering that Hussars originated in Hungary, so the Austrians were absolutely no strangers to light cavalry at all. And they organised their light cavalry in regiments of 8 squadrons and their heavy cavalry in regiments of 6 squadrons. Now, I don't normally necessarily go into the unit formations in these kind of videos, but it's important because they have a special rule called Abteilung, and that allows you to break down those humongous Austrian units into smaller ones. And when I say humongous, I mean absolutely humongous. If you're looking at, say, a Hussar regiment, and you're using one figure represents 20, then you're looking around about 60 figures, perhaps, for that regiment. So that's why it's much preferable to break them down into smaller units. And we are actually going to start with the light cavalry. There are 2 types of light cavalry that the Austrians have. They have Hussars and they have Uhlans. Now, Uhlans are just lancers. They've got exactly the same stats and rules as everyone else's lancers, with the exception that they are a large regiment. So they have 9 close combat attacks. They have the Lance special rule, which minuses 2, I think, to your save. Yeah, it is 2. Well, it's 2 if you're infantry, -1 if you're against cavalry. They've got the Marauder special rule. So these guys are, best ranging out and taking on the flanks of the enemy. Now, we'll come back to that and how likely that's going to be in a bit. We've also got Hussars as well. Now, Austrian Hussars don't have any special rules either. They've just got the standard Marauder, and I think that's a little bit of a shame because Austrian Hussars were considered to be the most dashing of all, although perhaps their battlefield performance doesn't quite reflect that. But I am told that even today, certainly older Austrian gentlemen, particularly in Vienna, will click their heels when they say goodbye, which I think is particularly awesome. So, yeah, I don't know if that's true. If anyone lives in Vienna, please let me know. I'd like it to be true. But, yeah, so there's no special rules for the light cavalry, apart from the Abteilung. We're going to get to that later. And we'll move on to the medium cavalry. Now, medium cavalry for the Austrians consists of 2 different types, which are effectively exactly the same. You've got the Chevaulegers and you've got the Dragoons. A fun story about the Chevaulegers is I bought second-hand. I bought some Perry Austrian Dragoons and the metal ones. And I thought, oh, yeah, well, I'll do. I painted them white, and I thought, well, to differentiate the units, I'll paint 6 of them Chevaulegers. They'll be the start of a Chevauleger regiment. I'll leave the other half white. So I painted half of them green. I was like, yeah, it's awesome. And then I read that by 1809, which is when I was doing them for, they'd moved to white. I was like, I'm not painting these guys white again. So I just left them green. So you've basically got Chevauleger and you've got Dragoons. They're effectively the same. I would say, however, that the Chevauleger in Black Powder, they do have the Marauder special rule. They're a bit of an interesting one. They have Marauder, whereas the Dragoons have Heavy Cavalry D1, which means that they're particularly good when they are used in conjunction with each other, which is not something that historically would have happened. The Austrians were very known for their poor inter-unit coordination. So that's an interesting one. I'm going to talk about how to use them on the tabletop and how that differs from their historical/reality way. And then finally for Austrian cavalry, because the Austrians have no guard units, so the final one that they've got is their out-and-out heavies, the Kerasias. And these have, in addition to the regular heavy cavalry D3, they've got 9 attacks. They're a large unit. If I know, that's for a regular size unit. They've got 9 attacks. They've got morale 3, they've got stamina 3, morale 3 plus, and they've also got reliable as well. So that's something that most units don't have. It's a nice little bonus that they have, and again, well, we'll talk about that shortly. So far, nothing unusual or spectacular there. The Austrian Cavalry are very similar to the French Cavalry in their stats, and anything that I've said about them, I can say about the Austrians from just a pure dice rolling perspective. If they charge against lighter opponents than them, they should do very well, and they should all be very good against infantry. If they get charged by heavier opponents, they're probably in some trouble. But not necessarily, and the reason I say not necessarily is because what the Austrians lack in skill, they absolutely make up in numbers. You should have humongous numbers of units of these guys, and they should be large units as well. I don't mean, sorry, I should say large as in, if you're representing on the tabletop, if your normal unit is 12, I'd probably go for 16 for the Austrians. They may still count as a normal unit, but I'd probably just have them that little bit bigger and look a little bit more intimidating on the battlefield. Now that said, you can have large units of cavalry. I would be tempted not to. The reason for this is that Austrian commanders don't have very good strategy ratings. There's no chance of getting a 9, and they are unlikely to be independent or decisive when you roll for the random attributes for the commanders. So I would suggest that what you need to do is you need to try and stack as much static res for your cavalry as possible. Now, we've talked about static res before. What that is, effectively, it's supports for your unit. It's the things that add to combat resolution that aren't reliant on dice rolls. You know going in that you're going to have 2 secure flanks and 1 support at the rear, so you're going to get +3. That's the maximum you can get for static res, and that's something that you as the commander can control. You can't control what dice you roll, but you can control how much static res you've got. And this is where that Abteilung special rule comes in. Now, it combines with another special rule that the Austrians have, that they can't issue brigade orders. They can only issue brigade orders to different battalions of the same regiment, if it's infantry, or groups of squadrons from the same regiment, if it's cavalry. Now, I mentioned earlier on that the Austrians had 6 for heavy and 8 squadrons in their light cavalry regiments, and that's why I mentioned it, because it breaks down quite nicely into 2, 3, or maybe even 4 different units. Now, one of the big things is that you are giving up quite a lot. You're taking a large unit and turning it into multiple small units. For the Hussars, I would be tempted to turn it into 4 small units, and for the, for the lights, I would make it 4 small units, and for the heavies, I would make it into 3 small units. And that's just because it goes along the number of squadrons. So if you've got 3 units, you've got 3 units with 2 squadrons there, which confusingly was called a division in the Austrian army. So yes, that would be the historical way of doing it. If you're using points, then these cost 8 points per unit. So that may be dependent on how many points you've got, is how many of those you can afford. But if you're playing from an order of battle, I'd be tempted to split them down into 4 small units for lights, 3 small units for heavies. And the reason for this is, as I say, it's that static res. Now, it's worth remembering that Austrians cannot command brigade orders. Sorry, they cannot issue brigade orders. So, you don't want to be mixing units in your orders if you can avoid it, especially if you've got Kerasias in that formation, because they have the reliable special rule. So, you want to be including multiple units from the same regiment if possible. So for instance, let's say you've got the Karl Herzog Hussars. You've got 1 unit, 1 large unit, they've got 9 attacks. Awesome. You say they're going to charge the enemy Hussars in front, the 7th Hussars in front of them. That's fine. That's 1 order, job done. Or you can say the 4 squadrons of the Karl Herzog Hussars will charge the first squadron making contact, the other squadrons in support. That's still only 1 order. All you've done is made it more specific. But what you've allowed yourself to do there is get that charge in and the other units supporting them. And this is where we talk about that static res. Now, that unit is only a small unit, so it's got much less attacks than the 9 it would have if it was large. But it's got those 3 guaranteed combat resolution points at the end. Now, that's that's good because that is the equivalent of, let me see, 3, 6, 12 more attacks if you're hitting on 4s, or 9 more attacks if you're hitting on 3s. The reason for that is if you've got 9 attacks and you're hitting on 3s, then you should hit around about 6 times. Half of those will be saved, so that gives you those 3 extra points. So you're not giving up 9 attacks, or if you're hitting on 4s, 12 attacks, in order to get that +3. That's why static combat res is so powerful, because it's always in the bank. It doesn't rely on luck. You know where it is. So that's one of the reasons why I would have them as small units. The other reason, now this is going to be super gamey. Some of you aren't going to like this. If you don't like this, that's absolutely fine. But some of you who do like the more sort of gamey, the more competitive aspect of it, it just means that you've got thousands of units out there that you can just force the enemy into square with. You can harass them on the flank. You could do all that kind of goodness. Now this, I should say, is not how the Austrian Cavalry operated. In fact, had the Austrian Cavalry operated this way, they would have been a lot more successful. But if you've got one large regiment, you say, right, I'm going to charge that infantry unit there. They form square. Brilliant. I can charge a different unit. They form square as well. Awesome. I've now pinned down 2 French battalions, which means that my infantry can move up. I can pound them with my horse artillery or even my regular artillery. Fantastic. Great. If, however, I split that Hussar regiment into 4 small units, they can all declare a charge against a different infantry battalion, forcing 4 of them into square, and they can all do it to a second one as well. So instead of having 2 infantry battalions in square, I've now got 8 enemy infantry battalions in square. Remember, of course, the overwhelming firepower of Austrian infantry is absolutely incredible. We talked a lot about that in the Austrian infantry video. So I would suggest that that's another reason that you want to get those units in. Make use of the Abteilung special rule. Get those smaller units out there, and you'll be laughing. Now, there are some very big downsides to having multiple small units. I'm going to talk about those on Wednesday in the How to Defeat Austrian Cavalry video. So if you're not an Austrian player or you think you're going to be facing them, I would highly recommend that you subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to make sure you get the notification of when that's happening. There wasn't one this week because of the football, but there certainly will be next week. And that's I don't think that was a nice organic plug for getting you to subscribe to the channel there. I'm obviously getting good at this YouTube game. Now, historically, the Austrians, they didn't coordinate their charges. That was their biggest problem. But in Black Powder, you can. As I said, you want to be using the Abteilung special rule. Now, it's not always going to be that simple. One of the problems you're going to have is that your brigade commanders, you either have only 1 unit, which you can break down into 3 or 4 units per 3 infantry brigades or whatever the limitations on the Austrians is, or you have those 2 regiments. You can have 1 to 2 regiments in either the light or the heavy cavalry brigades. So you could have those 2 regiments and risk them being separated. I'll be honest with you, that would be what I would go for. The reason being, in fact, no, it's brigades, isn't it? Not regiments. So the reason being that because you've got the Abteilung special, you've got the built-in supports. For argument's sake, a French Hussar general, he's going to have to coordinate both his regiments together. You don't have to do that as an Austrian. You can just coordinate the 3 or 4 units that come from that 1 regiment together, and you can do that twice. So it means that if one of them fails, it's not necessarily the end of the world because you've got that intrinsic support in place already. So let's take a light cavalry brigade, for example. You can have up to 2 regiments in there, and I would recommend, now this is something that I don't normally say, but if you're playing with points, I would 100% recommend that you upgrade your light cavalry regiments to veteran. That gives them an extra attack, and it also gives them reliable. Now, it doesn't say anything about it not applying if they use the Abteilung special rule. So you pay 8 points for that, and you get an extra attack per small regiment. That's what it sounds like to me. And you get reliable on all 8 of them, or 4 of them as well. So that's really strong as far as I'm concerned. You are paying a point for the extra hand. You're paying a point for reliable on each of those 4 units. I would honestly, I would not leave home without it. In fact, if it came to a choice of I either have one unit with that upgrade or 2 regiments without it, I'd probably take the 1 unit with that upgrade, if I'm honest. I'd also be looking at investing in a staff rating 8 officer as well, because with the reliable, it effectively makes me staff rating 9, which is as good as a French commander. It's not getting much better than that. Maybe a strategy rating 9 commanding the guard. That's probably the only way you're going to get better than that. This suddenly makes your large, unwieldy, almost like grinder type units. This makes them incredibly fast flanking forces which your enemy cannot ignore. Alright, they may only be small units, but if there's 8 of them suddenly appearing on the enemy's flank, then suddenly that attack is not looking so rosy, is it? So you really, really want to make use of these regiments. Use the Abteilung special rule. If you need to order 1 regiment at a time, that's fine, because it could even work out better. If you've got 2 Hussar regiments and you order 1 and he zips out onto the enemy's flank, and you order the second one and he fails, well, now he's got a decision to make. Does he attack the ones that are right up in his grill, in his flank, or does he ignore those and try and smash the guys in front of him? Maybe he leaves some elements behind to watch the rear guard, so maybe suddenly that old guard brigade that was advancing just drops back a little bit just as a defensive measure. So this is the questions that Austrian Cavalry let you ask your opponent. As I say, this is not necessarily how they would have worked in history. It's not how I would have represented them. I'll put it that way. Remember, we talked about in a previous video on building better brigades that you really want to go for brigades of 2 regiments if you can. And this is absolutely perfect for Austrians. This is something which has not been clarified in the rules. It's not been FAQ'd. So, this is absolutely enter at your own risk territory here. And it's also, I should say, one of the reasons why I keep on saying the Austrians are the best army in the game. So you've got 2 regiments in the brigade. Now, if you have 1 or 2 regiments in a brigade, they both have to be destroyed for that brigade to be broken. That's fine. Destroying 2 units, definitely doable. But you ain't got 2 units. You've got 8 units. Because you've broken them down into those Abteilung formations. Suddenly, instead of destroying 2 units, your opponent has to destroy 8. They've all got Marauder. They're all, if you make them reliable, and you've got that strategy rating 8 commander, you really need a strategy rating 8 commander. Then suddenly you've got 8 strategy rating 9, effectively, Marauder units that you have to destroy to break that brigade. Basically, your opponent is never breaking that brigade. You only get 1 of these in your army, so you want to make the most of it. I cannot see for the life of me why you would ever not do that. The only thing I can think of is points, and the points, they ain't that bad. If you've got those small units, then you're looking at what? 8 points a unit, so 8, 16, 32, plus it's actually 6 for the upgrade, not 8 that I thought it was. So suddenly you are banging in at 38 points for 4 units that are reliable. They've got 6 attacks, and they are strategy rating 9 effective due to that reliable. I think that's really good. Now, they've only got stamina 2 each, so they're not completely devastating, but that's a lot of units for your opponent to destroy. And it could even get to the point where 1 or 2 of those units hang back at the back of the board just to make sure that unit doesn't get destroyed. This, I should say, is absolute Gruyere, Edam. I can't think of any different kinds of cheeses. I don't really like cheese. But this is absolute Blue Stilton levels of cheese. If you feel that is not how the game should be played, you know what? I'm absolutely there with you. You'll get absolutely no argument from me. If, however, you want to win, then you can use them that way. Suddenly, these 8 units are going to be very, very upsetting. That, to me, definitely needs an FAQ or something like that, and it should be that if you break them down into their smaller units, then that's the number of units in the brigade. But I think it could be, I mean, that is certainly, you could, rules as written, you could argue that already. I, however, would argue that, well, I've selected 2 units. The fact that I can break them down, well, that's not making new units, that's just breaking down an existing unit. So you can argue it either way. I think if you're being gentlemanly, you would say, well, this brigade is a brigade of 8 regiments, which, don't get me wrong, that is also going to be quite scary to break. But if you are, playing absolutely letter of the law, I want to win this game, then I think you could also argue the other way as well. So that is the end of the Gruyere zone. There is no more cheese to be had for now around about the Abteilung special rule. It's less important on the heavy cavalry, to be honest. The reason being that the light cavalry you really want to use to harass the enemy, force them into square, stuff like that. The heavy cavalry you want to actually punch through. Now that said, I absolutely would Abteilung my heavy cavalry as well, unless I was playing against an opponent with lots of elite or heavy cavalry. If I was playing against a guy who had 2 or 3 large regiments of French Kerasias, I might be tempted to keep my units large, just to counter them, but I think that would probably be a mistake. I'd be better off going for a small one and keeping the +2 static res by having supports to the flanks, or maybe 1 on the flank and 1 on the rear. You don't necessarily need to upgrade your commander to strategy rating 8, because they've got reliable anyway, and you're not necessarily going to be zipping around the flanks and things like that. The Uhlans I mentioned earlier on, they come in the advance corps, or advance brigade I guess it will be, part of the list, which is a bit of a weird one. It's a bit of, it's a mixed formation of infantry and cavalry. I may do a separate video on those kinds of units where in the future. The Prussians have units like that as well. But as it stands at the moment, Uhlans, you want to use them as almost like traditional lancers. I would be tempted to put them in against enemy mediums. So they are the guys who want to be charging dragoons or enemy chevalier, things like that. Kerasias they might struggle with. Hussars, again, they should be very good against Hussars, but it seems a little bit of a waste, if you ask me. If they can get into the flank of Kerasias, though, absolutely go for that. That's when they're at their absolute strength, if they can get into the flank of units. So we've talked about special rules. We've talked about how they appear on the the battlefield, the tabletop. But I also, and we've also looked at how we select them in our armies. But what I want to close the video out doing is having a look at how we can use them historically and how they were used by Austrian commanders. Now, it has to be said that Austrian commanders were perhaps not the most inventive commanders, shall we say. Plodding would probably be not an unfair term to use. And this means that they use them very conservatively. They would often be used in 1 or 2 regiment penny packets. Now, we've spoken about how you can break them down on the battlefield to make that a little bit more manageable. But they would often go in fairly unsupported against the French cavalry. Now, the French cavalry could have as many units as the Austrians, but theirs would be full regiments as opposed to just pairs of squadrons. So you need to watch out to not be outnumbered by the enemy cavalry. Now, you can do this in a few ways. You can either use what I've been talking about, the static res. You can use maybe 4 units in the front and then you outflank with the other 4 units, or 3 and 3 if you're using medium or heavy cavalry. But the other key thing to remember as well is your infantry. Your infantry are so good. They can form battalion mass, so even in square they can still move, which means that you can be far more aggressive with your cavalry than Austrian commanders were traditionally. They wouldn't hold them back in reserve, like, say, the Prussians did, but they wouldn't necessarily send them roaring around on their own like the French did either. They're sort of a mixture of the two. I think the best way to use them would be very much like the British. You can use them as counter-attacking units. You advance with the infantry if you're advancing. Now, I spoke at length that you don't really want to be advancing with Austrian infantry. You want to kind of be defending. But the cavalry should be there to counter the enemy's cavalry and then break up their attacks. As I said earlier on, you can use units to force enemies into square, which breaks up their French attack. One of the great things about having the multiple units, I talked about how your 4 units can force 8 enemy infantry units into square. It's unlikely that you're ever going to need to do that, so you could use 1 or 2 of those small units to force a couple or 3 or 4 enemy units into square, and then use the rest to fend off the enemy cavalry. The fact in the rules that you get the pluses for having such huge units, you don't really get any minuses, it has to be said. I mean, strategy rating 6 and 7 should really be the limit for Austrian cavalry commanders, if you ask me, but that's not, and you can get up to 9 quite easily by adding the reliable special rule. So that's it, really. It's a bit of an interesting one because there's almost not that much to talk about because they're very similar to the French, and I would recommend that you go and watch the French regiment, even if you're an Austrian commander, because the French and the Austrian cavalry are very similar. Go and watch the French cavalry, the French cavalry episode to get some ideas from there as well. But I wanted to spend most of the time of this episode talking about that Abteilung special rule because I do think it has the potential to be very, very strong. Now, I am going to talk about on Wednesday the flip side of it, the negatives, but spoiler alert for Wednesday, I honestly think that the disadvantages are massively outweighed by the advantages. Can't think of many times that I wouldn't use it, as I said. And that's when you know that a national special rule is very good, when you're going to use it 99% of the time. If you're a historically minded Austrian commander, particularly with the cavalry, you'll just want to use it as a bit of a hammer, so there's not really a huge amount to say about that as well. But if you are more of a sort of a game-focused player, then you can use them to do some quite exciting attacks around the flanks and things like that. But I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for listening. This has been a little bit shorter than I would have liked, but England are playing in the Euro final tonight, so I need to get to prepare myself for that, both mentally and drinkingly. I'm not sure. Libationously? Yeah, that's probably not weird. Anyway, but thank you very much for listening, and I will see you guys on Wednesday when we look at strategies and tips and tactics for defeating the Austrian cavalry. Cheers.